March is Women's History Month, when women are honored and recognized for the impact that they have made on society throughout history. Women's History Month is celebrated in the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and Russia, corresponding with International Women's Day on March 8th, and Canada celebrates in October. Said Abigail Adams to John Quincy Adams, "Remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable than your ancestors." Women's History Month originally began as an observance of International Women's Day, which is on March 8th every year. It started when thousands of women rallied together in New York City for better working conditions and the right to vote in 1908. The holiday received formal recognition when the United Nations commemorated the day in 1975. 2 years after that, the United Nations gave the date an official recognition by deeming it an international holiday. Women's History Month in the United States began as a week-long observance, but when feminist groups noticed a lack of women achievements being taught in school curriculum, it was called for National Women's Month to be built around International Women's Day. So I've also chosen a few books to suggest for reading during Women's History Month or throughout the year. So the first book up is Hood Feminism by Mickey Kendall. In Hood Feminism, author Mickey Kendall discusses the difference between modern feminism and hood feminism. Modern feminism, which includes the more privileged individuals whose goals are to reach the higher level need of actualization, such as becoming promoted or becoming CEO, whereas the hood feminist includes more of the working class individuals, those who live in the inner city or rural communities, whose main goal is to make a way out of no way in order to survive. She also argues that the focus is not on the basic survival of the many, but on the increased privilege of the few. And she questions how we can stand in solidarity when it is likely that some women are oppressing others. Next is I Am Malala, Malala Yousafzai's autobiography. Malala was a 15-year-old Pakistani girl who was shot in the head by the Taliban while riding on the bus home from school for speaking out against the Taliban's oppressive rule on the education of girls. And she miraculously survived. By the age of 16, Malala had become a global symbol of peaceful protests and the youngest nominee ever for the Nobel Peace Prize. She went on to become an internationally acclaimed human rights and education activist. Malala also talks about her family, her father, who was the owner of a school, and she talks about her mother's lack of education. She says her parents always encouraged her to write and attend school. And here's a picture of Malala and her father. Today, Malala continues her work as one of the world's most powerful and influential voices on female education. The next book is Half the Sky, Turning Oppression into Opportunity for Women and Girls. The authors of this book are Nicholas D. Kristof and Cheryl Wooden, and they are a husband and wife who are both journalists. And I thought that was interesting because what would two journalists do together? Well, they wrote this book, and in it, they share the real life stories of women and girls throughout Africa and Asia who have lived and experienced the oppression of sex trafficking, forced prostitution, gender-based violence such as sex violence, child child marriages, female genital cutting, among other things. And each of these stories end as an example of how these women were able to overcome their oppression and how their lives were transformed with the help of education, microfinancing, and other means of help. These stories also demonstrate that the key to true economic progress lies in unleashing women's potential. If you're interested in knowing more about this topic, then this book is definitely a good start, and you can also watch the documentary on Pluto. Next book is The Radium Girls, The Dark Story of America's Shining Women by Kate Moore. The Radium Girls were a group of female factory workers who contracted radiation poisoning from painting watch dials with self-luminous paint, and they ultimately died. The story takes place in 1917, Newark, New Jersey. Yes, right here in the U.S. Two other factories were opened in the 1920s, one in Ottawa, Illinois, and the other in Waterbury, Connecticut. And during this time, the U.S. economy benefited from the war in Europe. The girls' ages ranged from 11 to 16, and many of them came from poor working class backgrounds, mostly immigrant families. Dial painting was thought of as the elite job for poor working class girls because it paid so well. The most skilled worker could earn 3 times as much as the average factory worker. And many of the women thought of this job as their patriotic duty to help the country once the war came to the U.S. As the demand for workers increased and vacancies were open, the women who were supposedly lucky enough to have secured a position there would tell other family members and friends about the position. So when workers were affected by radiation, there was often more than one family member who was affected. Back in 1917, not a lot was known about radium. It was thought of as a wonder element, safe and beneficial to health. There were many products sold with radium in them that could be purchased from the drugstore. Things like radium pills, radium Band-Aid dressings, radium lotion, makeup, toothpaste, milk, butter, even lingerie to boost your sex drive. Wonder how that works. And the rich and famous were drinking radium water as a health tonic. So when the Radium Girls were told to use their lips to put a point on their paintbrushes, the question was asked, does this stuff hurt me? And they were told no, that there was nothing to be afraid of, that there was no danger. But that wasn't true. After being told that the paint was harmless, the women ingested deadly amounts of radium. Besides lip pointing, the women would paint their lips, teeth, face, fingernails, and various parts of their bodies so that they would glow in the dark during the evening hours after work. And it became such a common thing to see these women literally glowing in the dark as they walked past that people nicknamed them the Ghost Girls. And as a result of the women's constant exposure to radium, they eventually began to have health-related problems. And this, of course, led to many lawsuits that lasted for years at a time. Some of the women were compensated and some of them weren't. This also led to the establishment of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, as we know it today. So in the end, this story serves as, and I quote, not only a historical antidote for workers' rights, but also a cautionary tale of societies and corporations that value money over human lives. So this was a very interesting story. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and not only in the story itself, but also in Arthur Kate Moore's research. Kate Moore is a Sunday Times best-selling author. She's a book editor and ghostwriter. And in 2015, she directed and acclaimed productions of These Shining Lives, which was a play about the Radium Girls. And she says that she found the Dial Painter story very powerful and interesting, so much that it inspired her to write about them. So she says her research took her to New York and Washington, D.C., Newark and Orange, New Jersey, and to Chicago and Ottawa, Illinois. She says that she walked in the women's footsteps and met their families, visited their homes and their graves. She stood in the lobby of Grossman's office and at the site of the Dial Painting Studios. And she remembered the Radium Girls. And she says that through this book, she hopes that we remember the Radium Girls. It's a very interesting story. And there is also a movie to go with it. I haven't watched the movie yet, but I believe that at one point it was on Netflix, but I definitely know that you can find it and watch it on Roku. So if you're interested in watching the movie, then you can check it out on Roku. And that's it. The Radium Girls. Gotta love it. And my final book, last but not least, is Hidden Figures by Margot Lee Shetterly. Hidden Figures is the true story of four once little known of Black women mathematicians who worked as human computers for NACA and NASA during the space race in the 1930s through the 1960s, a time when segregation and other Jim Crow law requirements were enforced. So the story is about these women's lives, their career accomplishments, and the steps that they had to take to get there. While I know a lot of you have already watched the movie, I've seen it a few times, and I thought it was very interesting to see these women's accomplishments and their contributions to space aviation at that time. I like the way they were portrayed by actresses Taraji P. Henson, Janelle Monáe, and Octavia Spencer. For entertainment purposes, a lot of what was in the book was left out in the movie. And some of the women's real life accounts were altered or divided among other character portrayals, which is common. A lot of times the playwrights or the script writers can only condense but so much of the history into the story and still orchestrate it in such a way that is still entertaining to the audience. Mrs. Katherine Johnson, portrayed by Taraji P. Henson, was a mathematician that helped plan the missions that sent the first Americans into space, into orbit, and to the moon. Her work included calculating trajectories and emergency return paths for Project Mercury's spaceflight. She was known as a human computer. Mrs. Johnson has received many awards and honors for her work. She even has a Barbie doll named after her. Mary W. Jackson, portrayed by Janelle Monáe, worked with the wind tunnels and the airflow around the spacecraft. She became the first Black woman engineer, and she also took a demotion from engineering in 1979 to manage the women's program at NASA. She improved the hiring and promotion process for women, and NASA named the DC headquarters building after her. Mary W. Jackson, the first Black woman space engineer. Dorothy J. Vaughan, portrayed by Octavia Spencer, was a mathematician and human computer for NACA and NASA at Langley Research Center in 1949. She became acting supervisor for West Area Computers, the first African American woman to receive a promotion and supervise a group of staff at the center. Mrs. Vaughan was the first respected Black female manager at NASA. Dr. Christine M. Darden. While she was not portrayed in the Hidden Figures movie, she has played many roles in the space and aeronautical field, a retired researcher and a senior staff, National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Christine Mann Darden, born 1942, mathematician and aeronautical engineer. Christine Darden spent 25 years with NASA researching the physical properties of the shock wave known as a sonic boom. She earned her MS in mathematics from Virginia State University and her PhD in engineering from George Washington University. She became the first African American woman at NASA's Langley Research Center to be promoted into the Senior Executive Service, the highest rank in federal civil service. And there we have it, ladies and gentlemen, the 4 real-life hidden figures of space aviation and aeronautics from the movie and the book. From my left to right are Mrs. Dorothy J. Vaughan, Mrs. Katherine Johnson, Mrs. Mary Jackson, and may they rest in peace. And our last hidden figure, who is still alive today, Dr. Christine M. Darden, and she is 81 years old. Also, a few words about author Margot Lee Shetterly. She is a writer who grew up in Hampton, Virginia, where she says she knew many of the women in Hidden Figures. She is an Alfred P. Sloan Foundation Fellow and recipient of a Virginia Foundation for the Humanities Grant for her research into the history of women in computing. And she lives in Charlottesville, Virginia. Very interesting. She grew up knowing these women. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is all for today. If you have hung in with me at this point, then I thank you and you are appreciated. If you skip through here and there to get to this point, you are also appreciated. Thank you very much for watching. If you like this video and if this video was helpful, then please, by all means, like and subscribe. Thank you for watching and have a great rest of your day. Goodbye.